22nd century science. Welcome to episode 0 of a 22nd Century Science. Astrology is not what you think it is. My name is Paul Westron, and I'll be introducing several of these episodes over the next few weeks. Episode 0 is a primer for you to understand the concepts of this subject and my point of view. I'll start as I mean to go on, so expect more of the same over the coming episodes. Astrology is not what you think it is. A good place to start with this is Tad Mann's depiction of the solar system. I love this picture. There are more accurate ones now, but this was the first of its kind, and I remember Stephen Fry attacking Tad on UK TV back in the early 1990s. He said something along the lines of, "How dare you steal the discovery of Crick and Watson for your nonsense ideas." He said this because Tad referred to it as a helix and likened it to DNA. As you can see, it is the sun followed by the planets flying through space in more dimensions than we usually depict the solar system flying through space. Anyway, I'll be using some special astrological references and terms, so here are a few translations. The first one is the word synastry. Synastry means relationship astrology. The next one is progressions. Progressions are the moving horoscope, so the horoscope moving through time. Natal chart means birth chart, so natal means birth, and so the birth horoscope, the picture of the sky that you're born with, or the moment of your birth, that's a natal horoscope. A progressed horoscope is the natal horoscope moving through time. Transits are the planets where they are at any point in time. Now, for example, in astrology, people look at the natal chart and then they look at transits to the natal chart, and the angular relationships of planets are called aspects. So the moon and the sun can be at any aspect in the natal chart, but Mercury and the sun can only ever be in a conjunction. That's because Mercury never gets more than 28 degrees away from the sun, but a conjunction being 0 degrees. An opposition, 180 degrees. And then we have some other very important aspects. I'll refer to squares sometimes. They're 90-degree aspects. And trines are 120 degree aspects. So that's a third of an equilateral triangle, and a square is a quarter of a square. So they're the main terms that we'll be coming back to over and over again as we talk through these different episodes. Back in the 1600s, the Enlightenment had just begun, really, and they had good reason to believe in those days that astrology was a pseudoscience. Back then, they were keen on seeing the universe in a materialist, rationalist kind of terms. And science was in its infancy. It came about that in 1666, on December the 21st to be exact, astrology was denied entry into academia. That's because the first Academy of Sciences in Western Europe was created by the Prime Minister of France, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, on that date. And he decided which subjects would be admitted to the Academy, and astrology was the main one that wasn't admitted. Obviously, there were some similar subjects that were admitted. Medicine, for example, looked exactly the same as astrology back then, but it was essentially brought in on the back of surgery, which was much more advanced in those days compared to medicine. However, nowadays, if we consider that we might live in a simulation, astrology starts to make sense. Problem is, people who are interested in simulations won't consider astrology because there have been very few, or no, to their knowledge, no positive experimental outcomes, so they won't even consider it. So why were there no positive experimental outcomes? There were no experiments. Basically, what happened in 1666 wasn't just that astrology was kicked out of academia and it became a parlour game. It was basically defunded. So no research, no patronage as it was in those days, no research, no development took place and has took place since the 1650s in astrology, because quite simply no one funded it. Science has developed since then, and so the scientific method has developed since then, and so have the academic institutions that have developed since then. And so we're reliant on the decisions made in the 17th century. Now, let's not beat about the bush here. Astrology was kicked out of academia in 1666, and it's one of the most data-reliant constructs that we have. 17th century systems were incapable of testing such a construct. So the decision was essentially to never fund any research, and this happened before we were equipped to test it. So if you are under the impression that astrology has been thoroughly tested, think again, because it simply hasn't. It simply wasn't in a position to be thoroughly tested. What has been tested is the ancient Greek idea of astrology, because of course it's not been developed, it's not been researched. No one has put any time or effort into challenging any of the concepts that came down to us from Ptolemy. And so in that respect, it has stagnated. It's completely been caught in amber. And you could bring back to life a 17th century astrologer and they could work on the subject today quite legally and probably quite successfully, and they wouldn't even have to learn about Uranus, Neptune and Pluto, or Chiron and Lilith and all the other points that we use these days, or astrologers use these days. There are about 800,000 physicists in the world at any one point. And so if you do a quick calculation on what that means around about 120 billion hours of physics research is done every century. It's a similar, probably a higher number for medicine, and possibly a higher number for pharmacology. But let's just use physics, because we know that we've got a fairly good idea of how many physicists there are in the world. So if the team of skeptics that are tasked with assessing all of astrology's claims, they're led by an 86-year-old chemist who lives near me, and he is a former astrologer. So he's someone who's turned his coat already. He can't turn it back. So he's got a vested interest in not finding anything in any of the experiments that are done in astrology. But essentially, his team have found about 1,000 experiments, and they constitute about the same amount of experimentation that is done in physics every 20 minutes. That means, quite simply, that there is not enough data, not enough experimentation, not enough research, not enough development. People don't learn the subject to research it. You don't learn about astrology to go out there and try and understand whether it can be regarded as a science. You don't do that. You learn the subject as it has been handed down since essentially Ptolemy and through the Middle Ages. You learn it to practice it. You don't learn it to research it. So one of the problems with researchers is if they don't learn it, and they don't learn it well, and they don't understand what it is they might be dealing with, they won't change any of it. They won't look to change any of it. And the thing about astrology is you need to find a variable that will stand up to testing, and that's really, really hard. As far as I'm aware, I'm probably one of the few people in the world, if not the only person, that's ever done it. Which is not a boast, it's just a fact of life. But astrology has a long history, but it's not a history of research and development. No one's been out to create any revolutions in this subject because simply it doesn't have the funding of the people. It doesn't have the funding, it doesn't have the experimenters. So it was abandoned in the 17th century and has not changed since. So I mean to demonstrate in this series that this is why skeptics believe it to be a pseudoscience, which is a science where you can't do scientific predictions. So it looks like a science, but you can't make scientific predictions with the pseudoscience. The thing is, we found out you could. And we found out you could by looking at it from a different point of view, from a different angle. Very similar to the scene in Contact, where S.R. Haddon shows Ellie Arroway how to understand alien communications. We added a dimension to astrology, and it started to stand up to testing. And it stood up to testing so well, we were able to repeat our tests, and we were able to repeat our experiments and get the same results. And we've been able to do it in micro experiments, and we've been able to do it with experiments using skeptical data, the data of skeptics. So they basically prove our point. So the marriage of Karl Popper and Henny Popper and Paul Thagard and Ziva Kunda and Brian Cox and Stephen Fry and Richard Dawkins, their marriages prove my point. Their data's available. Sorry, guys. So anyway, if you actually do the work to evaluate this subject, rather than just commenting on the meagre amount of experimentation that has been done to date, you can actually start to enjoy it from a scientific point of view. The joy that scientists get from making discoveries is the same thing I've experienced in this subject over the last 23 years. So I did a single experiment that lasted 23 years. So that meant I did it over and over again over a 23-year period. No one, to my knowledge, has ever done that with any kind of, has ever found a variable in astrology that enabled them to do a 23-year experiment. So anyway, in this series of video podcasts, I'll be talking about what I did, I'll be talking about the implications of that, and I'll be talking about what it means for you. So join me for episode 1, which is about collision graphs, which is another thing that I'll have to introduce you to. A collision graph is a graph that demonstrates or shows a progressed aspect moving through time. And it shows how it forms, becomes exact, and fades. So join me next time. It's a 22nd century science. And remember, astrology is not what you thought it was.
It's still in the game. Somebody's pulling your chain. About 22nd century science.